The Odyssey of a Fallen Corsair. On the morning of October 19th, 1944, as a pale autumn sun tried to break through the clouds over Rechlin airfield in northern Germany, a story that had begun nearly 7,000 miles away in the Pacific silently reached its next chapter. Few men standing on that airfield, engineers in grey coats, Luftwaffe officers with clipboards, technicians chilled by the northern wind, could have imagined the impossible journey the aircraft before them had endured. And fewer still would understand how many lives, choices, and fragments of fate had shaped the moment now unfolding before their eyes. The airplane sat alone on the grass, its dark blue paint covered over with Luftwaffe markings, its once American insignia now transformed into black crosses hastily brushed across its wings. But its silhouette gave it away immediately. The proud inverted gull wings, the massive radial engine, the long, purposeful fuselage. It was unmistakable. A Vought F-4U Corsair, the warhorse of the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps, a machine born for the brutal heat of the Pacific, not the cold fields of northern Germany. Yet here it stood, impossibly, like a relic shipwrecked far from home. And in that strange moment, as the German test pilot Hauptmann Dietrich Verreer walked toward the aircraft, it seemed that the winds of two oceans, two continents, and two dying empires met around that single machine. The Corsair's journey had begun months earlier, in the suffocating tropical heat of Peleliu and Palau, where American marine aviators flew daily into battle against Japanese positions. Its pilot, Second Lieutenant James Morrison, had launched into the sky on August 23, 1944, escorting SBD Dauntless dive bombers toward the island of Babelthuap. He was young, like so many pilots in those years, barely beginning the arc of life that war would try to bend and break. High above the Pacific, Morrison's engine, his lifeline, betrayed him. A catastrophic loss of oil pressure forced him down, gliding toward a thin hope, a strip of shallow water near a small island he believed to be empty. But islands in war rarely remain empty for long. Japanese naval infantry pulled him from the wreckage. He became a prisoner. His aircraft, however, became something else, a prize. The Japanese had never possessed an engine like the Corsair carried. The Pratt & Whitney R2800, a roaring, relentless powerhouse capable of more than 2,000 horsepower, represented everything Japan lacked: industrial strength, mass production, and an engineering philosophy shaped not by scarcity, but by abundance. They repaired the aircraft as best they could at Truk Atoll, studying every bolt, every cylinder, every whisper of power that engine held. Yet even they understood their limits. Japan's testing facilities were stretched thin, their airfields bombed repeatedly, their engineers short of equipment, time, and fuel. And so, in a moment that would echo far beyond the Pacific, the Japanese made an unusual decision. They offered the Corsair to Germany, a desperate gesture between struggling allies, an attempt to share secrets in hopes of surviving just a little longer. A plan was formed. The submarine I-29 would carry the Corsair's engine, propeller, and key parts toward Europe, while the airframe itself travelled by a separate route cloaked in diplomatic secrecy. History, however, rarely allows such plans to remain intact. The I-29 never reached its destination. On October 10th, deep in the Philippine Sea, American submarine USS Swordfish found her and sent her to the bottom. Dozens of Japanese and German scientists, technicians, and weapons specialists vanished with her, along with the precious R2800 engine. But the Corsair's airframe, that stubborn shape of bent wings and riveted aluminum, kept moving, across oceans, across borders, through neutral ports and shadowed diplomatic channels whose details remain classified even now. It was ferried like a secret no one dared to speak aloud. Somehow, impossibly, by the middle of October 1944, it arrived in Germany tired, battered, and incomplete, but still magnificent. Now, at Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's most capable engineers gathered around it with a mixture of awe and disbelief. This was a machine born from a different world, one where factories hummed instead of crumbling, where aluminum was plentiful, where engineers had time to refine, polish, and perfect their designs instead of rushing them under the terror of nighttime bombings. The aircraft's very presence was a reminder of realities Germany preferred not to confront. And yet, the story of how it arrived here was not simply one of machines, but of men. It was about a young American pilot who did everything right, yet lost his engine at the wrong moment. A group of Japanese technicians who labored for weeks over a captured enemy fighter because they knew their own nation's survival might depend on what they learned from it. A submarine crew who perished in silence beneath the sea. Unnamed diplomats moving pieces across continents in a game they understood was nearly lost. And German engineers who looked at the Corsair and saw, for the first time with painful clarity, a vision of the industrial giant they were fighting, an enemy whose strength did not come from luck or individual brilliance, but from unshakable industrial will. As Dietrich Vera placed his gloved hand on the Corsair's cool metal skin, he couldn't have known the entire journey. He didn't know Morrison's fate, or the desperate repairs at Truk, or the sinking of I-29, but he could feel, in the weight of the moment, that this machine carried history inside it. This Corsair had crossed oceans, traded hands between enemies, survived sabotage, shipwreck, and secrecy to arrive here at the heart of Germany's war machine, quiet, still, waiting for someone to awaken its roar again. Soon, that roar would shake German skies. Soon, Vera and every pilot at Rechlin would learn the truth of what American industry had created. And soon, commanders across the Luftwaffe would feel the chill of recognition. They were facing a weapon their nation no longer had the strength to match. When Germany met the Corsair, shock in the halls of Rechlin. When the Corsair was finally rolled into the long, echoing hangars of Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's most secretive and prestigious testing center, a hush fell over the engineers and pilots who had gathered to meet it. This wasn't just another captured aircraft. It wasn't a Spitfire with patched bullet holes or a P-51 Mustang taken from an emergency landing in France. This was something entirely different, an American naval fighter that had traveled halfway around the world to arrive in the heart of Germany in October 1944, at a moment when the Reich was fighting for breath. Rechlin was a place where aircraft were judged without mercy. Its engineers were brilliant, its pilots unsentimental, and its mission absolute. Understand every strength and every weakness, then relay those truths to a war machine desperate for answers. For years, Rechlin had tested dozens of Allied planes, British, American, Soviet, each one dissected, measured, evaluated. But nothing they had ever received looked like this. The Corsair seemed enormous by German standards. A 9,000-pound empty weight, more than 14,000 pounds when fully fueled and armed. A wingspan with that unusual inverted gull bend that gave it the lean, predatory look of a bird built for storms. A massive engine cowling that suggested barely contained violence. German engineers circled the fighter in silence, notebooks ready, pencils sharp. They had read the intelligence reports from the Pacific. They had heard the whispers. But seeing the aircraft up close, touching its thick aluminum skin, noting the heavy-gauge rivets, observing the perfect balance of strength and flexibility in the wings, they began to feel something much deeper than curiosity. They began to feel concern. The first shock came with the engine. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp was unlike anything Germany had produced. Even the engineers who admired the BMW 801 radial engine pride of the Focke-Wulf 190 were stunned by what they saw. The R2800 wasn't just powerful, it was refined. Every assembly was clean, every fastener properly sized and machined, every bearing polished, every cylinder perfectly matched. There were no shortcuts, no substitute materials, no wartime erosion of quality. This engine represented an industrial power capable of producing excellence at scale, while Germany, bombed by day and night, scraped for raw materials and stretched its production lines past their limits. Dippel. Ing. Vera Oswald, a Daimler-Benz engineer temporarily assigned to Rechlin, examined the Corsair's supercharger system and could hardly believe it. 2 stages, 2 speeds, intercooling. A system that let the Corsair hold its power at altitudes where German fighters gasped for breath. He wrote in his notes that American engineering had reached a level that matched or exceeded Germany's best efforts, a sentence that would have been unthinkable to write just 3 years earlier. Then came the airframe. To German eyes, it was overbuilt, far too strong, too heavy, too reinforced. But that was because German engineers were thinking like designers of land-based fighters that operated close to home. The Americans were thinking like sailors fighting over endless ocean expanses, where one burst of flak or a failed landing could mean a pilot lost forever. The Corsair's landing gear was rugged enough to survive the brutal impact of a carrier deck. The wings were strong enough to withstand violent catapult launches and abrupt wave-offs. The entire structure carried the philosophy of survival. What struck the Germans most wasn't just that the airframe was strong, it was strong without being crude. Every reinforcement had purpose, every structural member carried precisely the load it was meant to bear. It was as if American designers had all the time, all the tools, and all the resources they needed to build an aircraft, not for one mission, but for a war that would last years. Then there were the systems. The hydraulic network astonished the technicians. Landing gear, flaps, brakes, wing-fold mechanisms, even cowl flaps, everything worked with fluid pressure, redundancy layered on redundancy. German fighters used simpler electrical and mechanical systems that were easier to build under pressure, but far more vulnerable to combat damage. The Corsair, on the other hand, was built with the assumption that the unexpected would happen, and that the pilot needed every chance to bring the machine home alive. By the third day of inspection, the Rechlin team quietly admitted something among themselves. This aircraft was built by a nation not merely fighting a war, but prepared to win one. They moved next to the armament. 6 Browning, 50 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing, capable of delivering 17 pounds of metal per second. A German Bf 109 G6 delivered less than half that. The Corsair carried 2,400 rounds of ammunition. A Bf 109 pilot carried around 60 30mm cannon rounds, enough for just a few seconds of firing. As they inspected the Browning mounts, the German engineers kept asking the same question in different ways. How can they afford this? How do they produce so many of these engines? How can they build fighters this large in such quantity? How do they maintain this quality under wartime conditions? The answers were never comforting. One of the senior engineers, Klaus Hartmann, traced the wing route with his gloved hand and whispered, almost to himself, "This is not built by a nation under siege. This is built by a nation at full strength." By the end of the first week, morale at Rechlin, already strained by months of bad news, had shifted in a way no one spoke aloud but everyone felt. Germany could test this aircraft. They could measure it, analyze it, write their reports. But they lacked the industrial heart to build anything like it. And in war, engineering without industry is only a dream. When the Corsair was finally assembled and prepared for flight testing, the staff stood back and watched the massive fighter taxi toward the grass runway. Its engine thundered across Rechlin like a reminder from another world, a world where factories were still untouched, where fuel was plentiful, where pilots trained for hundreds of hours instead of a few dozen, a world Germany no longer belonged to. And, as the test pilot climbed in, fastening his harness and preparing to bring the Corsair back to life, a quiet truth settled across the airfield. Germany was about to learn just how far behind they had fallen. The flight that shook German confidence. Dietrich Verre takes the Corsair to the sky. The morning that Hauptmann Dietrich Verre, one of the Luftwaffe's most seasoned test pilots, climbed into the cockpit of the captured F-4U Corsair, the air above Rechlin was cold enough that his breath fogged the canopy glass. October light spilled weakly across the grass runway, turning the frost into a thin shimmer as engineers watched from the sidelines, clipboards tucked under their arms. They had spent weeks taking the Corsair apart, studying every bolt, every bearing, every hydraulic line. Now it was time for the true test, a flight that would reveal whether the rumors were real, whether this American machine truly possessed the power Allied pilots claimed. Verre was no stranger to testing foreign aircraft. He had flown Spitfires, Mustangs, P-38 seconds, anything the Luftwaffe could recover intact. He'd written hundreds of pages of reports, many filled with calm, technical prose. But even he felt a quiet weight as he lowered himself onto the high seat of the Corsair. From this vantage point, visibility stretched wide, clean, unobstructed. It was the first surprise of the morning. "Like sitting atop a horse," he murmured under his breath. The canopy closed with a reassuring clack. The cockpit, though foreign, felt thoughtfully arranged. American instruments were simpler, bolder, less cluttered than the busy gauges German fighters used. Everything seemed designed with the idea that a pilot in stress should never have to search for what he needed. Verre began the start-up procedure, his gloved hands moving deliberately. Fuel boost pump on. Mixture rich. Throttle cracked open. Starter engaged. The engine didn't just start, it announced itself. A deep, resonant roar exploded from the nose, shaking the entire aircraft with a power Germany had never successfully captured in a single-engine fighter. The R-2800 wasn't merely running, it was alive, thundering with a force that rolled across the field and sent a few technicians instinctively stepping backward. Even Vera, used to the power of DB-605 and BMW 801 engines, felt something new, something unsettling. He taxied slowly, weaving left and right because the nose was so long it hid everything in front of him. At first it felt awkward, but the wide landing gear gave him stability. German fighters lacked. Ground handling, a weakness in many Allied aircraft, was almost shockingly easy. He lined up at the edge of the grass runway. Engine power rose. The Corsair strained against the brakes like a beast wanting to run. Then he released them. The acceleration surprised him. For a 14,000-pound aircraft, it moved with urgency, with purpose. The tail came up almost immediately, the long nose leveling enough for him to see ahead. At 75 miles per hour, he eased back, and the fighter lifted smoothly, confidently, not fighting him, not wallowing from its own weight. And then came the climb. It began with curiosity. It ended with disbelief. At 5,000 feet, Vera checked the rate of climb, nearly 3,800 feet per minute, matching the Bf-109 G6. He expected the performance to fade quickly as altitude increased. That was the law of Luftwaffe engineering. Climb strong at low altitude, fade at high. But the Corsair did not fade. At 10,000 feet, 3,600 feet per minute, still equal to the 109. At 15,000 feet, 3,400 feet per minute, the 109 had already dropped to 3,000. At 20,000 feet, 3,200 feet per minute, nearly 50% stronger than the German fighter. At 25,000 feet, 2,900. At 30,000 feet, 2,500. At 35,000 feet, 2,000. The Corsair was still climbing. Vera stared at his instruments, scarcely believing the numbers. He leveled off only when he felt the aircraft nearing its operational ceiling around 40,000 feet, where most German fighters struggled to hold a straight line, let alone fight. Yet here he was, still with power, still with control authority, still flying an aircraft that seemed to defy the Luftwaffe's understanding of what a piston fighter could do. When he pushed the nose forward into level flight, the speed indicators told another brutal truth. At 20,000 feet, the Corsair cruised at 420 miles per hour. At 25,000 feet, 427 miles per hour. At 30,000 feet, over 430 miles per hour, a full 50 miles per hour faster than the 109 or 190 at the same altitude. This wasn't a small difference. This was the difference between life and death, between choosing the engagement or being at the mercy of it. Germany had built fighters to dominate at medium altitudes, to climb above bombers, to dive away from trouble. Now Vera understood, with a clarity that chilled him. The Corsair stole all of those strategies away. If it attacked from above, German fighters couldn't climb to meet it. If they tried to escape by diving, they couldn't outrun it. If they tried to break off combat, the Corsair could decide whether to let them go or follow them to the ground. He tested the dive next. At a gentle 30-degree pitch from 25,000 feet, the Corsair accelerated with smooth inevitability. 460 miles per hour at 20,000 feet. 520 miles per hour at 15,000 feet. 570 miles per hour at 10,000 feet, and still stable. German fighters shook violently at such speeds. The Bf-109's wings suffered compressibility. The WWII bucked and fought its pilot on recovery. But the Corsair? It simply listened. The controls grew heavier, yes, but not hazardous. Vera pulled into level flight with effort but without fear. When he regained altitude and took a long breath, he realized he had felt something he had not felt in a captured aircraft before: respect. And beneath it, something he refused to name aloud. The next tests confirmed a truth long whispered but never proven at Rechlin. German fighters could outturn the Corsair at slow speeds, but they would never force a Corsair pilot into that kind of fight unless the American made a mistake. At real combat speeds above 250 miles per hour, the Corsair's roll rate was astonishing. Its ability to reverse direction, to break free, to reposition, it made slow-turning duels irrelevant. It wasn't merely a strong aircraft, it was a forgiving one, a pilot's aircraft. By the time Vera landed, his gloves were damp, his face flushed from exertion. He pulled off his helmet slowly, as if climbing out of a dream he wasn't ready to leave. The engineers hurried to him, notebooks in hand. "What did you find?" one asked. Vera looked at them for a long moment before answering. "It outclimbs everything," he said. "Everything, at every altitude." "And the speed?" He shook his head helplessly. "You cannot run from it. It's stow. And diving? You cannot escape it." The engineers scribbled furiously, but Vera wasn't finished. "And there is one more thing," he said quietly. "Once it decides the fight is over, the fight is over. Not for it. For you." Silence settled around the group. In that moment, standing beside the American machine that seemed almost to hum with dormant strength as it cooled, the Luftwaffe understood something it had never wanted to face. America had built a fighter the Reich simply could not match. Not with its shrinking factories. Not with its dwindling resources. Not with its exhausted, undertrained pilots. And the war in the air, once Germany's greatest pride, was slipping away for good. A warning too late. The Luftwaffe's desperate tactical shift. In the days that followed Dietrich Verreer's test flights, the corridors of Rechlin grew unusually quiet. Technicians still worked, engines still rumbled in distant hangars, and officers still moved briskly between offices, but beneath every action, every conversation, sat an uncomfortable truth. Germany had just looked straight into the future of aerial warfare, and realized it no longer belonged in it. When the complete evaluation report was compiled in early December 1944, the language was startlingly blunt, stripped of patriotic optimism or comforting half-truths. For years, Rechlin's engineers had been proud realists, honest, yes, but still confident in the Luftwaffe's talent and traditions. This time, their confidence had broken. The report began with a sentence that circulated through the Luftwaffe like a cold wind. The F-4U Corsair represents the most capable single-engine fighter ever tested at Rechlin. There was no attempt to soften the verdict. No diplomatic phrasing. No balancing commentary. Just a simple, devastating truth. The report went point by point, and each point cut deeper. The Corsair outclimbed every German fighter at every altitude above 10,000 feet. It outsped them at the heights where American bombers and escorts operated routinely. It outdived them with stability they could not match. It could refuse combat or enforce it at will. And perhaps most unforgiving of all, its structure meant it could take hits and keep flying. German fighters, elegant and deadly in their own way, were built under a philosophy of minimalism, lightweight frames, tight performance envelopes, designs optimized for production under duress. They were fast, maneuverable, economical in materials, but they were also fragile. A Corsair could survive damage that would tear a Bf-109 or Fu-190 apart. The Rechlin engineers didn't just analyze, they warned. Their tactical recommendations read less like advice and more like survival instructions. Avoid combat above 20,000 feet. Do not attempt to dive away from a Corsair. Engage only from positions of overwhelming advantage. Use surprise. Use altitude if available. Use numbers if possible. And if none of these are present, break off. Immediately. The most painful line of all came near the end. The Corsair's performance cannot be matched by any German fighter in service or development. It was an admission Germany had avoided for years. Rechlin's report travelled upward into the hands of generals, into the offices of aircraft designers, into briefing halls where squadron leaders asked difficult questions no commander could answer honestly. It then travelled outward into the field, into Luftwaffe airbases scattered across Germany, France, the Netherlands, and the remnants of occupied Europe. And with the report came something else, the fighter itself. Circus Rosarius, a travelling warning. The Luftwaffe created a unique unit for captured Allied aircraft, Circus Rosarius, a kind of travelling demonstration team whose job was deadly serious, show German pilots what they were truly up against. By late December 1944, the captured Corsair, repainted in Luftwaffe splinter camouflage with yellow identification markings, was assigned to this unit. On its fuselage, it carried the code T9+CU, a stark reminder that even an enemy aircraft could wear German colours if only to teach German pilots how to survive. The yellow bands on its wings weren't decoration. They were fear made visible. They told flak crews not to shoot. They told pilots, "Pay attention, this lesson might save your life." Whenever Circus Rosarius arrived at a new base, Crowds would gather long before the Corsair's engine even started. Young pilots, many barely out of flight school with 50 hours of total flight time, studied it closely, trying to understand the machine that Allied pilots trusted with their lives. Veterans approached it more slowly, their faces lined with knowledge they rarely shared. They had seen the skies fill with American fighters, P-51 Mustangs, P-47 Thunderbolts, now Corsairs, and knew the air war was shifting around them like a tide pulling away from shore. Then came the demonstrations, the unforgettable lesson. A pair of German fighters, usually a Bf-109G or FW-190D, would circle overhead at varying altitudes. Then the Corsair would climb. The crowd watched. At 10,000 feet, the German fighters seemed to hold their own. At 15,000 feet, the Corsair began inching ahead. At 20,000 feet, the gap widened into something undeniable. At 25,000 feet, the Corsair looked as if it belonged to a different generation. One pilot at a demonstration later confessed, "It felt like watching a man chase his own shadow. No matter how hard the German fighters climbed, the Corsair simply climbed harder." Then came the dive demonstration. Both aircraft began at 30,000 feet. They dipped their noses downward together. At first, the two machines descended side by side like synchronized dancers. But within seconds, the Corsair surged forward. At 20,000 feet, it was clearly ahead. At 15,000 feet, it was a distant streak. At 10,000 feet, it was nearly out of sight. For many German pilots, that demonstration changed everything. "You cannot escape by diving," the circus pilot would say during the briefing. "You cannot outrun it. If you are caught high, pray the American chooses not to follow." The turning demonstration offered a small flicker of hope. At 6,000 feet, in tight horizontal turns, Bf 109 seconds and Fw 190 seconds could gain an advantage. Their lighter frames allowed them to circle more tightly. But the instructors emphasized a truth that made several young pilots swallow hard. This will only help you if the American pilot makes a mistake. Do not rely on it. New tactics for a fading Air Force. The tactical briefing that followed each demonstration felt less like a strategy session and more like a last effort to preserve lives. Avoid altitude. Never fight a Corsair above 20,000 feet. Attack only with numerical advantage. Strike once, then run. If a fight becomes prolonged, disengage immediately. And above all, do not chase a climbing Corsair. Do not dive away from it. It was not a message German pilots were used to hearing. For years, they had been hunters, masters of initiative, heirs to a legacy carved by aces like Hartmann, Marseille, Galland. Now, they were being told to run, to hide, to surrender the skies they once ruled. But this wasn't cowardice. It was practicality in a war losing all sense of equilibrium. Even with perfect tactics, perfect discipline, and perfect execution, the truth remained. Germany no longer had the aircraft, the fuel, the numbers, or the time. Squadrons that once flew confidently now counted every liter of aviation fuel. Experienced pilots were gone, lost to years of attrition. New pilots arrived with barely enough training to keep their aircraft level under fire. Knowledge alone could not stop the tide. The Corsair had arrived not just as an enemy machine, but as a symbol, a reminder of the industrial, logistical, and human forces Germany could no longer match. And as 1,945 approached, the Luftwaffe knew the truth. They understood the enemy perfectly. They understood his aircraft, his tactics, his strengths. But understanding did not equal victory. The skies were no longer theirs. The last flight of a captured giant and the truth it revealed. By the time February and March of 1945 arrived, Germany was collapsing on every front. Cities burned at night, rail lines shattered under constant bombing. Fuel dumps vanished in firestorms that lit the sky red. And across retreating Luftwaffe bases, the once mighty fighter wings that had guarded the Reich now lived day to day, clinging to dwindling fuel, exhausted pilots, and aircraft held together by hurried maintenance and hope. In that bleak landscape, the captured F-4U Corsair, the machine that had shocked Rechlin, humbled engineers, and frightened young pilots, was living on borrowed time. Its great R-2800 engine, a marvel of American industry, needed high-octane fuel Germany could no longer spare. Its complex hydraulics demanded parts no German factory produced. And so, the powerful fighter that once roared above Rechlin now sat more often silent on airfields scattered across central Germany, waiting for a future that could not come. But its story was not over. For months, the Corsair served with Circus Rosarius, travelling from base to base in one final act of service, an unwilling teacher offering the Luftwaffe a last chance at survival. Pilots gathered around it as though around a monument. They touched its wings. They looked into its cockpit. They studied it with a mixture of awe, fear, and admiration they rarely admitted aloud. And each demonstration, each briefing, sent a quiet truth through the German ranks. They were fighting a war they could not win. The Corsair was proof more than any report, more than any statistic, that American air power was rooted in something unstoppable, a massive, relentless industrial machine that produced fighters not by the dozens, but by the thousands. America had built this Corsair in March 1944. Since then, Germany had watched its own factories shrink, its testing centers bombed, its supply chains severed. Yet the United States, half a world away, had accelerated. The Vought plant in Stratford, Connecticut produced 400 Corsairs a month. Goodyear added 300 more. Brewster had contributed earlier as well. By late 1944, America was building 600 Corsairs monthly, and that was just one aircraft type. Germany's entire fighter production for January 1945 was only about 1,000 aircraft of all kinds. No test report could hide that arithmetic. No pilot's courage could undo it. Numbers do not lie. And that is why the Corsair mattered not simply for its performance, but for what it represented: America's unshakable ability to build, learn, adapt, and overwhelm. A war Germany understood but could no longer fight. Inside intelligence rooms across the Reich, something remarkable happened. American forces advancing through Europe recovered Recklin's complete Corsair evaluation report, written just weeks earlier, and they were stunned. Germany had understood the Corsair perfectly. Every weakness, every strength, every tactical implication, every strategic consequence. The Luftwaffe had not failed because its engineers lacked insight. They had failed because insight was useless without the means to act on it. Germany lacked the fuel, the pilots, the training hours, the time, and above all the industrial capacity to build a counter. American naval aviators trained for 200-plus hours before ever landing on a carrier. By late 1944, German pilots arrived at frontline squadrons with barely 50 hours total flight time. A young German pilot who read the Circus Rosarius briefing might know exactly how to fight a Corsair, but he would never have the altitude, the speed, the wingman, or the experience to use that knowledge. War had simply taken everything Germany needed to survive the very fighters it now understood so well. The Corsair's final days. As March 1945 turned to April, Circus Rosarius began to disintegrate. Aircraft were scattered across airfields that changed hands weekly. Some were destroyed deliberately. Others were abandoned when fuel ran out. Mechanics deserted, fled, or were reassigned to defend collapsing front lines. And somewhere in that chaos, the captured Corsair met its final fate. Some accounts say it was destroyed near Bad Wörishofen in Bavaria as German units retreated. Others suggest American troops may have captured it intact. To this day, the truth remains uncertain, lost in the smoke and confusion of a dying Reich. But one thing is certain: it had fulfilled its purpose. It had shown the Luftwaffe the future, a future they could see clearly but never reach. The lesson hidden in its wings. After Germany's surrender, American intelligence officers studied the Rechlin documents and were astonished by what they read. The Germans had not underestimated the Corsair. They had not dismissed it. They had not misinterpreted its strengths. They had admired it, feared it, and understood it with absolute clarity. One line stood out in the German report: "The F-4U demonstrates engineering and manufacturing superiority we cannot match under present conditions." So, it was not a condemnation of German talent. It was an admission of national exhaustion. The Americans found page after page detailing the Corsair's superior dive stability, its devastating firepower, its unmatched climb at high altitude, its rugged survivability, its enormous ammunition capacity, its quality of manufacture, its industrial origins impossible to replicate in a bomb-scarred nation running on fumes. In the end, the captured Corsair had done more than educate pilots. It had revealed to German engineers the scale of the world rising against them. In its bent wings, Germany saw the industrial strength of a continent. In its thunderous engine, it heard the power of factories untouched by war. In its resilience, it recognized a philosophy of design centered on keeping pilots alive, something Germany could no longer afford to prioritize. And in its presence, they saw the truth. The war was already lost. Not because German pilots lacked bravery or skill, not because German engineers lacked talent, not even because the Corsair was superior, but because the enemy had the strength to build 1,000 Corsairs, and Germany could barely build one fighter fast enough to keep up, a legacy that outlived the war. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the Corsair's legacy continued to live in the data it provided, the fears it ignited, the respect it earned, and the lessons it taught about air power, industry, and the fate of nations pushed beyond their limits. It showed that courage may shape battles, but industry shapes wars. It proved that understanding the enemy was not enough. One must have the means to act on that understanding, and it reminded all who studied it that behind every machine of war lies something deeper, the story of the people who built it, the people who flew it, and the world that shaped it. The captured Corsair, born in Connecticut, fought over Palau, repaired by the Japanese, and tested in Germany, had traveled farther and seen more than most machines or men ever would, and when its journey ended, it left behind a single, undeniable message. No matter how fierce the battle, the side with endurance, resources, and unity will always rise above.